The Measuring Show.
Since 1970, MPB has been enriching the lives of Mississippians.
Everything we do gives us the chance to grow and learn.
With your support, we are always there whenever and wherever you need us. Together through the years, together in the future. Please consider making a donation at mpbfoundation.org. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Every parent wants their child to grow, to explore, and to dream big. At MPB, we're proud to support families and teachers across Mississippi with trusted educational programming and resources that inspire learning and spark imagination. From PBS Kids favorites to digital tools and early learning support, MPB is here for young minds, engaged classrooms, and families who believe in the power of learning at every age. Empowering families, inspiring learners. MPB, your stories, our mission.
What's happening, Mississippi? You found the Sit Down with Russ Latino right here on MPB Think Radio, where we explore the ideas and people that are shaping Mississippi's future. We've got a great guest lined up today. Before we get to our guest, though, it's worth mentioning there were elections last night, Tuesday night in Mississippi for mayors and councilmen and folks across municipal government. The big races that people were watching was the Jackson race. At some level, that's anticlimactic because we knew that the Democratic primary winner would likely be elected mayor. In fact, John Horn was elected mayor with nearly 67% of the vote in Jackson. One of the more interesting races in Jackson was not the mayor's race, but the Ward 1 councilman race, where three contenders each essentially got 33% of the vote. 10 votes separating the first place vote getter from the second place vote getter, and only 25 votes separating first place from third place. Mississippi has a very peculiar law where general municipal elections do not go to runoffs. If someone doesn't achieve 50% plus one, that means the person with 33.6% of the vote can very well be elected to a Ward 1 council seat. Likely what's going to happen. We'll see what happens with affidavit ballots and whether or not there are challenges there. The Gulfport race was a race that a lot of people were looking at. A lot of energy, a lot of controversy there. Republican Hugh Keating ended up winning that race with about 54% of the vote when all of the votes were tallied last night, and that included the absentees. But a hard-fought race there. A lot of energy behind Democratic candidate Juan Williams' Barnes campaign. And so they played it to the wire. One other one that I'll mention, there was a lot of upheaval actually across the state of Mississippi. One other one that I'll mention really quickly is the Vicksburg race, where incumbent Mayor George Flaggs lost his reelection bid. And so lots of interesting things happening. Now the hard part comes where they actually have to govern. So
I had to come on there.
So
yeah.
Well, let's get to our guest, though. From Panama to New York City to Washington, D.C., from a Quaker school to the primetime desk of Fox News, our guest today has interviewed presidents, served in some of the most vaunted newsrooms in America, and written books that encapsulate movements. His latest book, New Prize for These Eyes, comes nearly 40 years after his 1987 book, Eyes on the Prize, told the story of the American Civil Rights Movement. Juan Williams, welcome to the Sit Down.
My pleasure to be with you, Russ. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, thanks for being on, and thanks for accommodating some election results there at the front end. Election season, no matter where you are, is always a big deal.
It sure is, and I think it's great that Mississippi Public Radio and Russ Latino keep folks informed.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We are glad to be here and glad to have you. So I want to discuss your book, but I wonder, I alluded to the fact that you immigrated to this country, I think when you were 4 years old, right? And maybe talk a little bit about how Juan Williams' formative years helped to shape your view of the world.
Well, I think the key thing is I know almost nothing about Panama. I don't speak Spanish. And so people, when they learn that I, in fact, was born in Panama, assume, well, you must speak Spanish and you must know something about Panama. In fact, I was the youngest in my family, and it's only my mom brought 3 kids, and the kids, my sister was 11 years older, my brother 8 years older. So I was the baby at 4, and they spoke Spanish. I did not. I went to all my schooling is in in Brooklyn, New York, in the USA, and then to a friend's school in upstate New York, and then a college in Pennsylvania. But Russ, you touched on something that is kind of deep for me because, as a kid, my mom was working in the garment district in New York, and, I was kind of like alone. I learned about the world by reading newspapers and sitting on the stoop in Brooklyn, New York. And so, some basic questions maybe that a kid who was more part of the American society at a very young age wouldn't have asked. I asked, like, who gets their trash picked up, and whose children get to go to the good public schools? And why is it that cops treat some people as citizens and some people as suspects? What's going on? I was just like looking around like a kid by himself because my mom's gone, my brother and sister are gone. And my basic instrument for learning about the world was newspapers. Remember, I'm not growing up in the social media age. I'm there. I'm born 1954. I'm 71 years old. And so I'm just picking up newspapers. And as a boy, I'm picking up the sports section first and then, eventually finding my way to the real power games on the front page of politics. But I'm just like listening and learning and reading about how America functions. And for me, my great dream was to become a writer to tell that story.
It's fascinating. And the reason that I asked that question, I had an experience a few years ago when the Civil Rights Museum opened up in Mississippi in Jackson. It's a great museum, by the way. People should go and experience that. I took a group that was an odd mix of people. So some conservative activists who are largely white, 50 plus years old, and then a group from an African-American church that also are relatively advanced in years, right? They had life experience. And so we toured the Civil Rights Museum together, and then we had a group discussion. And what came out of that discussion to me was that nobody was coming at the conversation, which was a hard conversation, in a nefarious way. Their experiences just were so different. And it just fundamentally reshaped the way they saw the world. So that you'd have one person talking about, well, I lived in the 60s and it wasn't so bad, who happened to be white, right? And another lady who was an African-American saying, well, when I went to a shoe store, they had to literally color my foot on a piece of cardboard, cut it out, and then stick it in the shoe to see if the shoe fit because they wouldn't let me try on the shoe. And just two very fundamentally different experiences that can yield different worldviews.
I don't think there's any question about it. And, actually, speaking to just that kind of situation. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I grew up in a neighborhood where you could see white flight taking place. Most of the elementary schools that I went to, and even into junior high school, were racially integrated. But you were fewer and fewer white people as the years went by. And you could see that there was, so for me as a child, a sense of, well, especially whites with money don't want to be here and they're moving away. And you could see the people who were remaining were lower income white people. Jewish people stayed for a long time. In fact, the church I went to was in the midst of a Orthodox Jewish neighborhood otherwise. So I got to meet people and talk to people. I had a sense of an integrated world. So, like my wife tells me stories like that woman told you, Russ, about, not allowed to try on shoes. She's from Washington, D.C., where I live now. And she tells stories about can't go into the big department stores, can't go into some of the restaurants and bars, and then separate bars and restaurants for Black folks. And, it's like a separate area. And again, just a different way of growing up, because it's not that I was the immigrant kid, but it's that I was growing up in an area that was not totally segregated, and I think opened my mind to race in a different way.
Yeah, and I do think when you're exposed to people who think different, who look different, who have different backgrounds, it's really hard not to develop empathy and compassion for other people. And if you're not exposed to that, it's a lot easier to be hard towards other people. So a lot of folks know you from Fox News, right? There's probably a whole generation of people that were born in the late 90s or past 2000, and Juan Williams is the Fox News guy. But
Yeah.
you had a really storied journalism career and continue to have a storied journalism career that preceded Fox, right? You were at the Washington Post for an awfully long time. You had a radio program that lasted for a long time on NPR. You've made a lot of different stops along the way. I'm curious, professionally, as you've had this experience, kind of what did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about the state of media, and kind of how has it changed?
Wow. It's a little bit like Forrest Gump. I say to Russ Latino, it's like I've been moving along. But I think, you're behind the microphone. You understand how intimate and tremendous it is to do a radio show that people may be at home alone. They may be in the garden. They're certainly in the car listening to Russ, right? And they come to feel like they know you, like you're their friend. I say that because when you're doing a newspaper reported piece, like I was the White House correspondent for the Washington Post, I was a columnist for the Washington Post. People may respect you, or if they read the byline, they say, "Oh yeah, I like that guy," or I'm familiar with that guy, even if I don't like that guy. And if you're on TV, it's the image that they see very strongly, and they become associated. They associate you with that image. I remember once at Fox, a guy who was a cameraman came up to me, and he said, last night my wife is really into this book, and she showed me the book and said I should read it. And you know what? The guy who wrote it has your name. Your name was on the cover. I said, what? What do you mean? What's the name of that book? And he said, I was on the I said, I wrote that book. He said, you wrote a book? I mean, it's like, what is going on? But he knows me from the other end of the camera. He doesn't know me from any library or bookstore. So it's just, you get different angles on who you are because you have people who know you through different lenses.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense to me. I mean, I think that also goes to the fact that we can very easily and I think incorrectly sometimes kind of summarize a person based on that one proof point or that one data point without understanding the complexity of who Juan Williams is or anybody for that matter, right? I mean, our limited experiences help to shape our narrative about the people that we interact with. I mentioned that you have been able to interview and interact with presidents over the course of your career. I do want to get to your book after break, but I'm curious about your interaction with presidents, having those multiple proof points. What is your sense of the monumental task of being president, and what is the type of person who is best suited for that role?
Wow, there's a lot in there, Russell. I have to break it down. You have to give me a second, but I think let me answer it this way. The president that I admired the most is George H.W. Bush, and he was a one-term president. But I wonder, we were just talking about my background and how people know you. I came to know him as president, but what really impressed me about him was he had been a baseball player at Yale. He had been a congressman. He had been CIA director, head of the Republican Party, vice president before he became president. And he was just a good guy. I traveled around America with him. I would often travel with him. Wasn't like the big press corps that we have today. He was vice president to Reagan. And oftentimes it was me, him, and a couple of his aides on a plane. It was incredible. But I just became a big admirer. I just really thought the world of him. And when you look at the different type of responsibilities, boy, I think of Ronald Reagan, the first president that I covered, as someone who really was helping America reinvigorate its hopes, its sense of aspirations. The whole Morning in America thing, I think it captures Reagan. It's not just a line. It really is positive, uplifting, strength, vitality. And, especially in this era of so many arguments over immigrants, he was welcoming. He liked the idea of America as a city on a hill, a light to the world. So, when you ask me, what does it take? What's the different takes? I think you have to understand different eras and different historical demands made on presidents. It's not the same job every time. And when you think of somebody like Obama coming in at a time of tremendous economic stress, the Great Recession, as they call it, what he did there was, again, a demand of the era, and he did start to reverse the losses and get us on the right track. So all of this is to say, it's not one job, it's different jobs with different demands. And I sense that you sense what the man can do and what he can't do, because the job it's beyond any one man.
I think it's interesting that you point out George H.W. Bush, because I think a lot of people think about that 4 years almost as a failed presidency. They remember read my lips.
Right.
At some level, if you just look, to your point, if you look at his qualifications, just on paper, he was the most qualified president of our lifetime, or at least of my lifetime. You might have others that you would bring up, but just his pedigree was incredible. And I think at some level, and I say this as a conservative, he captured part of what I believe it means to be a conservative in the way that he carried himself, right? Sort of the decorum and the genteel spirit in a way that I think should be a hallmark of someone who is composed and operates with sort of a conservative mind frame. I think H.W. Bush in a lot of ways carried himself very presidentially, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And I tell you what, so I am on Fox News, and I would guess I'm a little bit left of center, not much, but that's who I am. But to me, that's, what George W. Bush, H.W. Bush represented, especially as I hear you talk, Russ, about conservatism, is that he's someone you would say to your kid, I'd like you to be like that guy. That guy has been in the hunt for a long time. He's worked, he's earned his way. He treats people well. He even treats people he disrespects well. In other words, that he disagrees with or argues with. People can do business with him and trust him. And he's got a great family. As you know, his son became president. So to me, those are conservative, faith-based values that I respect.
We're talking with Juan Williams today. We're going to take a brief break. We come back and talk about Eyes on the Prize and the new prize for these eyes. That's hard for me to get straight both times. I say them right next to each other. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Desiree Frazier, host of the award-winning news program, Mississippi Edition. We bring you conversations about the latest news from across the Magnolia State. Whether it's politics, healthcare, or education, you'll hear in-depth discussions on issues that matter to you. So join us each weekday morning at 8:30 on MPB Think Radio, or download the podcast, listen through the app, and online.
Mississippi is a place of deep roots where every story matters and every voice can be heard. At MPB, we stand with our local communities, bringing you the voices of those who shape our state through local programming that reflects our culture across small towns to big cities, from the Delta to the coast. We tell the stories that define us, from the music that carries our voices to the leaders who inspire change. MPB brings you the heart of Mississippi, celebrating Mississippi one story at a time. MPB, your stories, our mission.
At the Mississippi Arts and Entertainment Experience in Meridian, we believe in the power of the arts, storytelling, and education, just like Mississippi Public Broadcasting. MPB connects communities across the state with quality programs that inform, inspire, and engage. Their audience is loyal and appreciative of businesses that support public broadcasting, which makes underwriting on MPB a smart investment. Join us in supporting MPB. Learn more at mpbfoundation.org.
listen to The Sit Down right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino. We're talking today with Juan Williams, Fox News political analyst, author, longtime journalist. Very interesting conversation about some of your life experience. And truthfully, I feel like I've gotten us off track, but I can sit here and talk about that all day because I know you've seen things that would be fascinating to people. Let's talk a little bit about some of your writing, though. And obviously, you know, eyes on the prize, it's 1987. You're what, early 30s?
Yeah, so I was it's actually the start of 88, but yeah, I think technically the publication date was the last month of 87 or something like that.
Okay.
So I was 34 years old.
And what motivated you as a 34-year-old journalist to say, hey, look, I'm going to tell the story of the civil rights movement?
Well, it wasn't me. What happened was there was a man by the name of Henry Hampton who had been in Mississippi, and seen some of the civil rights movement taking place. And I guess Henry was 20 years older than I was because he had already started some media operations in Boston. And he had been working for the Unitarian Church and had been sent down there when a Unitarian minister had been killed. And when he saw the drama and the fierce passion involved on both sides, he thought this is an amazing story. He reacted as a storyteller. So he began then to try to create a documentary, collect documentary footage of civil rights events. And that eventually led him to try to put together a TV show. As I say, he was involved in media up in Massachusetts and initially approached some folks who said, oh, this is coming after the tremendous success of, some of the shows about civil rights like Roots. And the people thought, hey, we should make a musical. We could have Sammy Davis or somebody play Dr. King. And he was like, no. He wanted to stick with the real story. And that's when I got involved. He got me as a journalist from the Washington Post and said, I see what you're doing in daily journalism. Can you help me tell this story and do it for a book? And I was like, yeah, I mean, that to me is a new challenge for someone who's been doing daily journalism. And as I explained to you earlier, been the White House correspondent at the Washington Post. And the idea then was to tell the story of the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century. And Russ, you know that story. I mean, that's the story of Dr. King. That's the story of people like Roy Wilkins and others, the civil rights leaders of that time, as they're trying to end legal segregation, in addition to the traditions, the customs of segregation. And, the story is just so amazing because I guess the highlight in many minds would be the 1963 March on Washington. And there you have Dr. King, you have this signal personality giving a speech in which he talks about the sons of slave masters and the sons of slaves would be able to sit down together, and that you would judge people on the basis of not the color of their skin, but the character. And, it's a moment that I think is just quintessential America, hopeful, aspirational. The book subtitle, by the way, was 1954 to 1965, America's Civil Rights Movement, 1954 to 1965, Eyes on the Prize. 54, again, fits into that story as the Supreme Court's decision ending legal segregation in America, in American schools. But Russ, that what happens is tremendous, what they call great opposition, mass opposition to integrated schools, and people creating academies and people fleeing schools and all the rest. And schools don't really start to make progress until the 60s. So it's that period, and there's so many amazing stories to be told. And, so now here I am 40 years later, and I'm thinking to myself, this is a very different time with regard to race in America. There's so much going on, but people don't see it as a separate movement. People say to me, oh, it's just an evolution of that first movement. I say, no, it's very different. First movement about ending segregation. This movement, well, think about how I see it. I see it as we live in a very different demographically made society. Earlier movement, 90% of the population in America was white. Today, about 60%. First movement, about 10% of the population was black. In a place like Mississippi, much more. But what we see today is the black population is now about 13%, but blacks are not the second largest racial group in the country. That would be Latinos. And then you start to think about what's the fastest growing racial group, and you say, oh, Asians. This is all a different society. You get a black president in this era. The first civil rights movement, people really were fighting for, and I think folks in Mississippi know this story so well, fighting for voting rights for black people. At the start of this show, you talked about elections. That fight for voting rights was made in the hopes that if you had black elected officials, those elected officials could do a better job of representing the needs and experiences of black people, like you were talking about the visit to the museum, that black people suddenly would have a voice, and that when it came to schools, you would have people who were looking out for what was going on with the black kids as well as the white kids. That was the idea. And in the second civil rights movement, as I see it, you see the fruit of that first civil rights movement when you get a black president. We never had that before. Here comes a black president. And he comes on the scene in a very different way than any civil rights leader of the first generation, even in between. He's not talking about the sins of slavery and segregation. He comes on the scene and he's talking about America's not black, not white. It's not conservative or liberal. He says it's America. We are Americans. And he says that his story, and remember, his dad was an African immigrant to the United States, his mom, a white woman from Kansas. He says his story wouldn't have been possible in any other country. So this is a very optimistic and different approach to race relations than Americans are accustomed to. Here is a black leader standing on the national stage and praising America as the one place where he would have had the opportunity to rise to become not only a Harvard law grad, but a U.S. senator, and then president of the United States eventually. And then that leads, of course, to so many political difficulties for him, but also political firsts for America. And you get a moment where you have even the people who are the strongest advocates in terms of civil rights activists in this era involved with something called Black Lives Matter, which comes to creation after Trayvon Martin is killed in Florida. But it's created on the internet, created by people in California who say, you know what, this kid, people worry about the fact he was wearing a hoodie or why is he walking down the street by himself? And then a volunteer security guard sees him as a threat. They said, it doesn't matter that he's wearing a hoodie and walking by himself and it's raining out. That security guard had no reason to confront him, to start a fight that leads to the child's death. Black Lives Matter. And you get Black Lives Matter, then you get attention to incidents with police. And, you know, even the incident where a Harvard professor, Henry Louis Gates, is involved with a police officer. And people are like, well, wait a minute. You know, the great hope of Barack Obama was that he said he's going to be president for all Americans, not black Americans, not white, but all Americans. But when you get a situation like Trayvon Martin, or earlier like Henry Louis Gates, he reacts as the black president. He says, oh, it's stupid for the Cambridge, Massachusetts police to arrest a man trying to get into his own house. Or in the case of Trayvon Martin, he says, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. And at that moment, and one of the things that really stands out in my new book is that you see the white political support for Obama evaporate, Russ. That at that moment, he goes from over 50% approval rating among whites to under 50% and never recovers, never again becomes supported by a majority of white Americans in the country. But this is, to me, a very different America going through a very different movement than what we saw in the first mid-20th century movement.
So there's an awful lot to unpack there, and I want to maybe hit you with a few quick questions. you talked about some of the civil rights leaders from the 50s and 60s. Obviously, Dr. King always comes to mind at the forefront. In Mississippi, we talk about people like Medgar Evers or Fannie Lou Hamer and some of those folks. When you think about what you sort of have coined as the second civil rights movement, are there leaders that emerge on that same level? And who are they?
So, people always ask me, the way they put it to me, Russ, is who's the new Dr. King? And I would say to them, there is no new Dr. King. Part of the tremendous change that I'm trying to describe in New Prize for These Eyes has to do with leadership. And if you look at the leadership of that first movement, someone like Medgar Evers is an NAACP leader who is in Jackson representing the NAACP, and he is an extension of the NAACP offices in New York, if you will. And if you think about someone who's involved with that, Fannie Lou Hamer, in terms of the voting rights, again, an agenda and message being sent by people who are in New York and Washington, the Democratic Party trying to integrate the Mississippi Democratic Party and all that. These are national efforts, but efforts that are centralized in terms of their agenda by major groups like NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, like that. In the second movement, you don't get the Medgar Evers, you don't get the Fannie Lou Hamers, you don't get the Dr. Kings, the Roy Wilkins, etc. Why? Because the platform is social media. And social media is so big and so diffuse that you get these three women, Patrice Cullors and others, Opal Tometi, who are out in California, and they're starting Black Lives Matter, and they're reacting to incidents around the country, but they don't set themselves up as creating an agenda for Black Lives Matter. Basically, they leave it to everybody in every local community to say, you're in Mississippi, you know the racial climate there, you know your needs, your community's issues, you speak to them. And what happens then is, I don't think most people to this day could tell you that, Opal Tometi or, any of these people are household names like a Dr. King. But the movement that they created, Black Lives Matter, of course, it dwarfs, absolutely, Russ, I really wanted to make this point. It dwarfs the power of the first civil rights movement and the Dr. King. Dr. King, as I said, had the Great March on Washington, and it attracted 250,000 people one day. Black Lives Matter, after George Floyd was killed, now it's almost exactly 5 years ago, 2020. There were thousands of marches across the United States, big cities, small towns, even rural communities, standing up for the idea of social justice, equality, not killing a guy by kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes. There were even marches overseas. Millions of people participated, and online, constant comment, organizing, fundraising that took place. Nothing like that in the first civil rights movement.
So can I push back a little bit and maybe get you to respond?
Sure.
So I understand what you're saying in terms of it dwarfing it in size, right? The sheer volume of people that engage through modern platforms. I would argue that that's true on most issues and most movements today, is that the internet has given a microphone to everyone. There's some negative to that as well, though. And so I would look at like the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s and say, all right, they delivered the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They delivered the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We got public accommodation law. We got integration. These are all very big public policy wins. Mm-hmm. What are the public policy wins of the second movement?
Well, obviously, I started out by talking to you about a Black president. First civil rights movement never had that experience. That's kind of like even beyond the dream. I never thought it would happen in my lifetime. And so I mean, it's amazing. That's a huge public policy, and electoral college win in American history. But the second thing to say as you talk about this is you think about some of the policies then that came out of the Obama administration, things like the Affordable Care Act, or what people in short call Obamacare. Again, it's a tremendous change, one that has impact to this moment as we speak. And then even more recently, after the George Floyd incident 5 years ago, you see big changes that, obviously when Biden was running for office, he said he was going to put a black woman on the Supreme Court. And it happened. Ketanji Brown Jackson is on the Supreme Court. When you think about efforts to stop voter suppression in the country, you think of Stacey Abrams and the work that she did in Georgia. And again, I don't think you would see a black man and a Jewish man as United States Senator from Georgia without the efforts made by Stacey Abrams, Black Lives Matter activists, and the like. And if you look at the Congress of the United States today, it has more women, more people of color than any time in history. So these are tremendous changes, and obviously that generates then policy and legislation. But the larger point is you have people who have voice and people who have power in place in America in a way that the first civil rights movement could only dream of.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an interesting point when you look at sort of the progression that over time our society and our political structures have become more representative of the population. Certainly. I think my only sort of thought is when I look at that era that Eyes on the Prize was about, I'm like, these are very definitive civil rights wins. And then when I look at the current era, you could say, hey, these are the byproduct of some of those very definitive civil rights wins. But it feels more disparate in terms of not having a central goal, right? There isn't an office in New York saying, hey, we're going to go after this policy objective next. And because of that, the goals seem like they come from all over the place. Does that resonate at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think this is why I felt the need to write the book 40 years later, is that people would say to me what you just said, which is it seems like more like this is the evolution of what happened in the first civil rights movement. It's not a distinct movement. It's just more of the same in some ways. And I'm saying, no, I see it as distinct. As I said to you, we're a different population in America today. But I think the key point to keep in mind is you are dealing with something so large and so clear in terms of legal segregation. Like, the Brown decision says it's unconstitutional to segregate children in public schools. And so they said, wow, that's a major moment. That's a, what do they call, landmark Supreme Court case in American life. And the passage of a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act, as you point out, Russ, these are clear legislative landmarks and victories. You fast forward into what I am calling the second civil rights movement, and you say, what's comparable to that? And in the way that I said there's no Dr. King today, I would say there's nothing comparable to that because we're in a different fight. We're in a different era. And in a different era, a lot has to do with lived experience. I know where I live in Washington, D.C., you can still look at public schools and see the reality that there's a lot of segregation still in public schools, despite what happened in 1954 and the Supreme Court decision. In fact, across America, it's like 80+% of Black and Latino children go to schools that are more than 90% Black and Latino, what they're called hyper-segregated. That's just a reality. And I think a lot of the second movement is about dealing with the lived reality of race in America, that you may have achieved a Voting Rights Act, a Civil Rights Act, a Fair Housing Act. But you look at the reality of what it's like to be Black, Latino, to be poor in America today, and you say we have to deal with these issues, and we have to deal with them with a different population. And with President Trump, I think when you look at President Trump, especially in the second term, as he goes after issues dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion, he oftentimes is like, wait a minute, why aren't you talking about the white experience? Why aren't you talking about discrimination against white people? And you're saying, wait a minute, we have to have honest discussions about, is race a legitimate consideration when a young person applies to a college? How about when they apply for a job? How about when we talk about American history? Should we talk about what Fannie Lou Hamer went through, what Medgar Evers went through? Or is that simply going to make some white child feel bad and guilty and we don't need to talk about it and it doesn't make America look good? That's the Trump angle. But there's a lot of people who say, you know what, America should be proud that we are resilient and we stand for principle and justice and equality, and that we have gone through these things and we continue to try to deliver on the promise of equal justice for all. That is the second movement, Russ. It's the lived experience, people dealing with the police problems, people dealing with income inequality, people dealing with bad schools, trying to figure out how you deal with race in a multiracial. In fact, we're a global society in some way in America.
We're talking with Juan Williams today. Very interesting conversation. We've got to take a brief break. We'll come back and maybe we'll talk about, is the second civil rights movement already over? That's a provocative question. We'll get Juan to answer it. We'll be right back.
Since 1970, MPB has been enriching the lives of Mississippians.
Everything we do gives us the chance to grow and learn.
With your support, we are always there whenever and wherever you need us. Together through the years, together in the future. Please consider making a donation at mpbfoundation.org. MPB, your stories, our mission.
When the weather turns severe, when breaking news affects your family, when Mississippi needs answers, MPB is there. We provide real-time emergency alerts, trusted news coverage, and live broadcasts of emergency updates. Available on TV, radio, and online. MPB is on the air and by your side every day of the year. Because when it matters most, Mississippi turns to MPB, Mississippi's trusted source. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Russ Latino. We're talking today with Emmy Award-winning journalist Juan Williams. Juan, before the break, we were unpacking quite a good bit there. I think at some level, part of my question is there room in this debate to recognize two things at once, which is to say that certainly there is historical injustice that continues to have second and third order consequences in our society, and that we are doing ourselves a disservice if we ignore that injustice. But by the same token, we have made progress. People are all different. You can't judge someone, to get back to this concept of, oh, well, that person's a white person, so there's some inherent evilness in them, or that person is a minority, so there's inherent goodness. But instead, you judge people based on the content of the character, right? And is there a place for those two mindsets to coexist, where you recognize the history, but simultaneously also recognize both the progress and the complexity of human beings?
Yeah, I'm alive. You're alive. We understand the complexity of human beings in our personal relationships, with our loved ones, with our churches, with our school. It's complex, Russ. But I would say that the big point is that, I think back to President Johnson, and President Johnson, in some ways, people, when he was talking about the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and he was, you know, getting the votes in the Senate for it, and people were saying, "Well, why do we need this? Everyone should be treated equally." He said, "Wait a second. Given what you just talked about, Russ, the history," he says, "Black people still exist under a blanket of what he called not only history but circumstance." And you talk about, economic denial, educational denial, legal separation that leads to deprivation in some cases. He was dealing with that in that era. And so we come forward, and I would say, of course, we have made tremendous progress. Look at this show. I wouldn't have the opportunity to speak to Russ Latino on Mississippi Public Broadcasting if we hadn't made progress. Russ, you and I talking like this just wouldn't have happened, in the mid 20th century, mid 1900s. But it's happening today. And I think that the part of the tremendous victory, if you will, for America has to do with, in a way, what President Obama said before he became president, that it wouldn't have happened in any other country. I think we are a light to the world in terms of what is possible in terms of a multiracial society struggling with a segregated past, but doing what is right. And it's been painful and difficult at times, but we're trying to do what's right. Some people would say Trump is a throwback because he has a lot of racial attitudes and policies that I think people find very difficult, especially on the left, and especially in the activist community, and especially in the Black activist community. When, just today he was taking the names off of ships.
How do you explain his success, relatively speaking, with African American males and Latino voters?
Well, it's relative. I'm glad you said that, because what you see is about a quarter of young Black men under the age of 25 voted for Donald Trump, and about half of Latino men under the age of 25 voted for Donald Trump. Now, overwhelmingly, the numbers, that's why I say the context is important. Overwhelming numbers, Blacks and Latinos still didn't vote for Trump. But he made inroads, and he made inroads in Black communities, sizable impact. And I think a lot of it has to do with people who are just fed up and frustrated with the establishment, with government, with traditional Democratic Party leadership, even though you had a Black woman running. I think they think, you know what? I don't see that the schools in my neighborhood are getting better. I don't see that I get a better job, a bigger paycheck. And they saw inflation rising. People talk about the price of eggs, and they just said, hey, look, this guy, he is a change agent. That's the way he advertised himself. He says he can solve problems. He's got a lot of money. He's got pretty women around him and all this, and his name on buildings. And I think that whole Trump persona is kind of beyond our politics. It's just that people want to invest in somebody they can believe in. And I think you ask about that success. I thought your question was going to be, well, how has he succeeded in winning twice in this environment of race and racial change that's taking place in the second civil rights movement? And I was going to say to you, Russ, that in answer to that question, I think there's a lot of white resentment and grievance and discomfort with the rapid rate of change, not only in the fact that you have fewer white people in America, but the rising number of Black people in power and with voice and saying that they're unhappy or not happy with things, or they want faster rate of change. And I would add in here a curious caveat, which is that, again, a lot of the Black activists were not happy with Obama. I mean, so you had a Black president, the great dream of the first movement, and you get Black activists in this generation who say, well, if there's a Black president, why is he not doing more for Black people? Why isn't he going out of his way and speaking to our agenda or creating an agenda that would serve the Black interest instead of talking about being president of all people? So the pressures are so distinctly different, and that's why I ask people to pick up a copy of New Prize for These Eyes.
Well, and look, I won't presume to speak for all white people, just as I wouldn't presume to speak for all males or any group that I happen to be a part of. I do think that there was, to put the good faith argument on it, I do think there was this sense that there were elements of the second civil rights movement, whether you're talking about Black Lives Matter or DEI, that went further than wanting to recognize historical injustice as a part of contextualizing where we are today. And it went to the point of trying to marginalize white voices in a way that I think a lot of whites felt was unhealthy, right? A lot of white voters looked at that and said, hey, look, it's one thing for you to ask me to understand this history. It's another thing entirely where I'm seeing job descriptions that literally say we're going to exclude white candidates. And I'm hearing stories from universities where people's voices are being marginalized. I think that is part of the fear around some of the movement. And it's why I candidly asked you about why it's not centralized, because I think in any movement you have sort of extremist elements and people latch on to that extremism and you get an equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah. And in fact, just to emphasize to the audience what you're saying, Russ, I think one of the great failures of the second civil rights movement is that you had elements within, and I think they're extreme, but they're elements within the Black Lives Matter movement that would say things like defund the police. And guess what? Then the other side picks up on that and says, oh, these people are radicals. They're crazy.
Well, that is radical, right?
Right. Well, that's what I think. But I mean, I'm just telling you, right? I'm here as a descriptor, but I'm just saying, describing the situation. But they would say, oh, that's terrible. And, even someone like John Lewis, who was, in Congress, had been involved in this first civil rights movement. People like Jim Clyburn still in Congress. They said it was such a mistake. It's like people shouting Black Power or Burn Baby Burn, right? In the first movement. It just feeds the other side to say, ignore those people. But I just, the larger point to your question is, I think that there are a lot of people in white society who are unaccustomed to Blacks, Latinos, and women having as much voice, and they're just uncomfortable with it. And I think Trump plays to their sense of anxiety at the rapid rate of change.
We're going to have to leave it there. Juan, thank you for coming on today. Lively conversation. Enjoyed it very much. You've been listening to The Sit Down. We've been honored to have Juan Williams on with us. Pick up a copy of New Prize for These Eyes if you have an opportunity. We will be back next week, Wednesday at 10 a.m. right here on MPB Think Radio. From Germaine Flood in the booth, Abram Nanny producing. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.